a forested sector in eastern Ukraine, 1347 hours on a recent winter afternoon. Temperature registered -15°C. Clear skies stretched overhead, the kind of sharp winter day that creates illusion of safety. Dense coniferous forest stretched across 37 square kilometers, primarily pine and spruce trees that had stood for decades, creating cathedral-like spaces beneath interlocking canopies. A Russian mechanized brigade, 3,400 combat soldiers supported by 98 armored and soft-skinned vehicles, conducted tactical movement through forest corridor that offered concealment from aerial observation and artillery targeting. The 23-kilometer route wound through dense pine and spruce forest that Russian planners assessed as providing excellent cover. The forest canopy would obscure thermal signatures from reconnaissance drones. Tree density would prevent effective targeting by artillery observers. Movement through forest was standard tactical procedure for avoiding Ukrainian surveillance. Russian planners assessed forest movement as low risk despite winter conditions. Forest fires were considered impossible in deep winter. Snow-covered ground. Temperatures were well below freezing. Water sources were frozen. Everything suggested fire was not a credible threat. The forest represented safety rather than danger. 4 hours, 12 minutes later, 2,789 soldiers would be dead from fire and smoke inhalation. 98 vehicles would be burned hulks with melted components and charred interiors. 37 square kilometers of forest would be reduced to ash and charred tree trunks, standing like grave markers. The winter forest that promised concealment would become crematorium, consuming entire brigade. This happened days ago. The burned zone remains visible from space as black scar on otherwise white winter landscape. Body recovery continues weeks later, complicated by extent of thermal damage to remains. The tactical implications of forest fire as deliberate weapon continue being assessed by military analysts worldwide. This is what occurred during those 4 hours 12 minutes. Winter forests present deceptive fire hazards that contradict common assumptions about fire behavior. Snow cover suggests fire impossibility to casual observers. Frozen ground appears inherently non-flammable. These perceptions are dangerously wrong for coniferous forests, particularly those dominated by pine and spruce species. Pine and spruce trees contain extraordinarily high resin content that burns readily regardless of season. The resin is a natural defense mechanism against insects and disease, but it creates severe fire hazard. Winter conditions actually increase fire risk through desiccation. Trees lose moisture through transpiration even in winter, drying foliage to tinder-like state. Dead undergrowth accumulates under snow cover, creating fuel load. Coniferous forests in winter can burn with devastating intensity, despite freezing temperatures that would prevent fires in deciduous forests or grasslands. Ukrainian forces observed Russian column entering forest through multiple reconnaissance sources and recognized extraordinary opportunity. Forest fires as military weapon have historical precedent extending back to ancient warfare, but modern application requires specific conditions that rarely align. The forest composition was ideal. Dense stands of resinous conifers spaced closely enough for fire to spread through canopy. Weather was perfect. Cold, clear day with moderate wind from west at consistent 15 kilometers per hour. The column would be committed to narrow forest road with limited maneuver space and no rapid exit routes. Ukrainian planning was methodical and professional, reflecting lessons learned from extensive combat engineering experience. Thermite munitions would initiate fires upwind of Russian column at multiple points simultaneously. Multiple ignition points would create fire line advancing with prevailing wind. The column, constrained to single narrow road through dense forest, would have severely limited escape options. Fire spreading at calculated 45 kilometers per hour through forest canopy would overtake column attempting to outrun it on winding forest road, where maximum speed was perhaps 30 kilometers per hour. Artillery prepared thermite rounds specifically for fire initiation mission. These specialized rounds contain thermite mixture, combination of aluminum powder and iron oxide that burns at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius when ignited. This temperature is sufficient to ignite green wood, living trees, or any combustible material. Thermite burns with extraordinary intensity, producing molten iron that flows down tree trunks and ignites everything it contacts. Each round would create reliable ignition point that wind would fan into spreading fire. Multiple rounds distributed across wide front would create fire line that would merge into continuous wall of flame. At 13:47 hours, as Russian column progressed deep into forest, with approximately half the vehicles already committed to Forest Road, Ukrainian artillery initiated fire attack. Thermite rounds struck forest positions 3 kilometers west of column position, upwind based on prevailing wind direction. Artillery fired 47 rounds in rapid succession across 2-kilometer front, creating distributed ignition pattern. The rounds were programmed to detonate in tree canopies rather than ground level, maximizing ignition effectiveness by showering burning thermite across wide areas. The rounds detonated in tree canopies 30 to 40 meters above ground, creating spectacular pyrotechnic display visible for kilometers. Burning thermite showered downward in brilliant streams like metallic waterfalls. Dry pine needles ignited immediately on contact. Resin in tree trunks began burning where thermite made contact. Within 3 minutes, dozens of separate fires merged into continuous line of flame, extending across 2 kilometers of forest front. Wind from west drove flames eastward with remorseless consistency directly toward Russian column position. Fire spread through forest canopy at extraordinary speed that ground observers found almost incomprehensible. Crown fires in coniferous forest advance much faster than ground fires because wind drives flames through treetops where fuel is driest and most abundant. Flames literally jump from tree to tree through overlapping canopies. The fire line advanced at calculated 45 kilometers per hour based on wind speed and fuel characteristics. Faster than vehicles could maneuver safely on winding single-lane forest road with limited visibility. Russian column detected smoke within 5 minutes of ignition. Scouts positioned ahead of main body reported fires to west, upwind of current position. Initial assessment was natural forest fire, possibly started accidentally by artillery fire or some other cause. Forest fires were known hazard even in winter under certain conditions. Within minutes, assessment changed dramatically as fire scale became apparent through direct observation and drone reconnaissance. This was not isolated fire or small burn, but advancing wall of flame 3 kilometers wide and growing wider. Column commander ordered immediate withdrawal eastward away from fire, following standard procedure for encountering forest fire. Doctrine specified that when encountering forest fire, forces should move perpendicular to wind direction to exit fire path or retreat rapidly to areas already burned where fuel is exhausted. The column attempted retreat along single narrow road that represented only viable route through dense forest. Traffic congestion developed immediately and catastrophically. 98 vehicles attempting simultaneous withdrawal on single-lane forest road created massive bottleneck that paralyzed movement. Vehicles blocked each other as drivers attempted to turn around or accelerate. Some vehicles attempted off-road movement through forest, but dense tree spacing prevented effective maneuver. Trees growing close to road, often within 2 meters, blocked vehicles attempting to bypass congestion by moving between trees. The column became trapped in stationary traffic jam, with fire advancing from behind. Fire advanced rapidly toward immobilized column with terrifying inexorability. Soldiers outside vehicles, either dismounted infantry or crews outside armor, saw flames approaching through trees like advancing wall. The sight was psychologically devastating. Wall of fire 15 meters high, moving through forest canopy like visible wave. Trees ahead of visible flames were beginning to smoke from radiant heat. Temperature ahead of flames created thermal wind that intensified fire spread by preheating fuel and creating draw that pulled fire forward faster. Smoke billowed ahead of flames in dense clouds, reducing visibility to meters and making breathing increasingly difficult. Column commander recognized developing catastrophe with growing desperation. Radio transmissions became increasingly urgent and eventually panic-stricken. Requests for aerial water drops from any available aircraft. Appeals for guidance from higher command. Reports of casualties beginning as forward elements of fire reached rear vehicles. The transmissions documented unfolding disaster in real time, creating audio record of catastrophe that would later be analyzed extensively. At 14:08, 21 minutes after ignition, fire reached western end of column where rearguard vehicles were positioned. Flames engulfed rear vehicles first with overwhelming intensity. Soldiers attempted evacuation from threatened vehicles, but fire spread faster than troops could run, particularly through dense forest undergrowth and deep snow. Thick smoke disoriented fleeing soldiers who lost directional sense. Many ran deeper into forest in panic, where fire caught them within minutes. Others retreated east along road, where vehicles blocked passage, creating human congestion matching vehicle jam. Vehicles caught in flames burned intensely with multiple fuel sources, contributing to inferno. Diesel fuel in vehicle tanks ignited, creating secondary fires. Ammunition in vehicle storage cooked off from heat exposure, creating explosions and flying fragments. Tires burned with dense black smoke. Rubber components melted. Soldiers trapped in vehicles died from heat before flames actually reached them. Interior temperatures exceeded limits of human survival within minutes as radiant heat from surrounding fire transferred through steel hulls. Infantry soldiers outside vehicles faced impossible tactical choices with no viable options. Remaining near burning vehicles meant exposure to intense radiant heat that caused burns at distance. Running into forest meant encountering advancing fire line. Retreating along clogged road meant slow movement while fire advanced rapidly from behind. Every option led to same ultimate outcome: death from fire or smoke. Smoke inhalation became primary killer, surpassing direct burns in casualty production. Forest fire smoke contains lethal concentrations of carbon monoxide produced by incomplete combustion, carbon dioxide from complete combustion, and numerous other toxic gases, including hydrogen cyanide from burning synthetic materials in vehicles. Soldiers breathing heavy smoke began experiencing rapid physiological deterioration, disorientation from carbon monoxide poisoning, weakness from oxygen deprivation, unconsciousness from combined effects. Many collapsed before flames actually reached them, dying from asphyxiation rather than thermal injury. Bodies would later be found in positions suggesting they fell unconscious and died from smoke rather than burning. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones orbiting high above smoke layer observed catastrophe unfolding with clinical detachment that contrasted sharply with human tragedy below. Thermal imaging showed heat signatures of burning vehicles and soldiers attempting desperate escape. The imagery documented complete disaster developing, entire column consumed by advancing firewall with nowhere to escape. Operators recorded hours of footage that would later be analyzed for tactical lessons and released selectively for information operations. Some soldiers reached areas already burned, hoping to find safety in scorched ground, lacking fuel for continued burning. This tactic works effectively in grassland fires, where burned areas provide safety, but it failed catastrophically in intense forest fire. Burning trees fell across areas already burned, creating new hazards. Embers from canopy fires continued igniting material in supposedly safe zones. Heat from massive fire created conditions incompatible with survival, even in areas where visible flames had passed. Ground temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Celsius. Air temperature approached limits where breathing becomes impossible. Radiant heat from surrounding fire caused burns at considerable distance. Russian command attempted aerial rescue operations with available helicopters. Mi-8 transport helicopters approached fire zone, attempting to evacuate trapped personnel. Smoke and heat prevented landing or hovering low enough for evacuation. Intense thermal updrafts from fire created dangerous flying conditions with severe turbulence. One helicopter attempting low approach experienced engine problems from smoke ingestion and barely escaped the area. Aerial rescue was deemed impossible. Conditions simply did not permit aircraft operations near or within fire zone. By 1500 hours, 73 minutes after ignition, fire had consumed entire column position. All vehicles were burning, burned, or about to burn. Soldiers who hadn't escaped were dead, dying, or would be dead within minutes. A small number, 611 soldiers, reached forest edges and survived by running 3 to 5 kilometers ahead of fire, emerging from forest with injuries ranging from serious burns to smoke inhalation. 2,789 soldiers remained in forest, dead or dying with no possibility of rescue. Fire continued burning for 18 additional hours before exhausting available fuel. 37 square kilometers of dense forest burned completely with devastating thoroughness. Temperatures in active fire zones exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius based on later metallurgical analysis of melted vehicle components. Hot enough to melt aluminum completely and soften steel. Organic materials were reduced to ash and charcoal. Bodies were cremated where soldiers died, leaving little recognizable remains in many cases. When fire cooled sufficiently for access 42 hours after ignition, recovery teams entered burned zone wearing protective equipment. The landscape was apocalyptic beyond description. Black ash covering everything to considerable depth, charred tree trunks standing like forest of grave markers, twisted metal that had been military vehicles. Human remains were difficult to identify in many locations. Most bodies were completely cremated by intense, sustained heat that exceeded crematorium temperatures. Bone fragments were scattered. Dental remains were sometimes only identifiable parts. Forensic teams eventually identified 1,456 bodies through various means. Dental records, metal identification tags that survived fire, forensic analysis of bone fragments, personal effects that somehow survived. Additional 1,333 soldiers were classified as missing, presumed dead based on unit rosters showing who entered forest. Remains were too damaged for recovery or positive identification. Many soldiers simply ceased to exist physically, reduced to ash indistinguishable from forest biomass. Equipment losses totaled $784 million, calculated at replacement cost. 98 vehicles completely destroyed by fire, with damage so extensive that salvage was economically impossible. Heat had melted or severely warped critical structural components. Electronic systems were completely destroyed. Weapons were damaged beyond repair. Burned hulks remained in forest as monuments to disaster, but recovery wasn't attempted. Vehicles were total losses. The tactical lessons were documented extensively and disseminated throughout military professional literature. Forest movement in winter is emphatically not safe from fire hazard as commonly assumed. Coniferous forests burn readily year-round given appropriate ignition source. Single-file movement on narrow roads prevents rapid withdrawal when threat develops. Concentrated forces in confined terrain are catastrophically vulnerable to fire attack. Natural phenomena can be weaponized with proper understanding and planning. The psychological impact on Russian forces was severe and enduring, creating trauma that persisted long after physical injuries healed. Survivors described incomprehensible horror, unable to escape, watching comrades burn alive, breathing toxic smoke that induced hallucinations, knowing death was inevitable and approaching. The sensory experience was overwhelming. Visual nightmare of flames everywhere, auditory assault of screaming and explosions, smell of burning fuel and flesh, taste of ash and blood. Many survivors required extensive psychological treatment for combat trauma that exceeded anything experienced in conventional combat. Families of deceased demanded accountability with increasing anger and desperation. Why was Column committed to forest route without assessing fire risk? Why was fire threat not considered in winter operations planning? Why was evacuation impossible when danger became apparent? These questions created political pressure that Russian government could not ignore. Families organized demonstrations demanding answers and accountability. The political crisis contributed to broader questions about military competence and leadership. The numbers define catastrophe with precision that becomes numbing. 2,789 dead. 611 injured survivors, many permanently disabled. 98 vehicles destroyed absolutely. 37 square kilometers burned completely. 4 hours, 12 minutes from ignition to complete consumption. 784 million lost permanently. 1,500 degrees Celsius peak temperature. 18 hours of sustained burning. This is warfare where nature becomes weapon, where winter forest becomes crematorium, where 4 hours destroys Brigade and leaves landscape of ash and charred monuments. The fire is extinguished. The forest is ash. The bodies are cremated. The survivors are traumatized, and military planners worldwide are learning that environmental conditions create opportunities for unconventional attacks, that forests are weapons waiting for ignition, that natural phenomena can achieve effects conventional weapons cannot match. Welcome to warfare where trees become fuel, where thermite artillery creates unstoppable inferno, where 4 hours in burning forest destroys 3,000 soldiers, where winter provides no protection from flames.